And I'm just going to post
All
it.
right, we are now live, or actually, we're being recorded.
Right.
We're now being recorded.
Yep.
Okay.
So, I guess welcome to the World Alliance of Qara'im weekly Parashath Torah study. We thank all of you for joining, whether you're here live or whether you're going to listen to it in recorded fashion later on. And the idea of this study is to fulfill one of the goals that we originally set down when we founded the World Alliance of Qara'im, which was to have free and regular public Torah studies for anyone who's interested, okay? And I must emphasize the word free. I don't want to go into details, but we will, unlike some other entities, we will never ever be charging a dime for these Torah studies. Everyone is welcome to join, and anyone of any background, as long as they're respectful, is welcome to join. Doesn't matter if you're a Muslim, Christian, Orthodox Jewish, already Karaite, completely secular. You know, as long as you're respectful and you express your opinions respectfully, you're welcome to join. So that's the idea. So we are fulfilling now something that we laid down a number of years ago when we founded the World Alliance of Qara'im, and the goal would be to have this on an ongoing basis. I think we've settled on trying to have it every Shabbat from now on. So tell your friends, tell your family, tell your neighbors, stop people on the street and tell them, hand out flyers in the grocery store, and let them know that the weekly World Alliance of Qara'im Torah study is occurring. So with that being said, Yaakov, any words of introduction?
No, I think you actually covered it.
Okay.
We're going to try to follow the Parashath reading that is in use by most Jews everywhere, just as a form of ease. And this week we're on Parashath, and we probably won't be able to go through the entire Parashath, just because as we go through it, we'll begin to discuss certain things, and it takes up a lot of time. But this is what we do. We also have a private Torah study, and this is what we do amongst ourselves as much as we can. Sometimes life just gets in the way and you don't have time.
If I could say one or two things, the idea of doing the weekly parsha that is done in most rabbinical synagogues, let me preempt any criticism, because the obvious criticism would be, what do you mean you're Karaites? Why are you, the rabbis are telling you to, it shows, even though you're Karaites, you're following the rabbinical ways. You're doing the parsha that is done in most rabbinical synagogues. And we thought about this a lot, and we've spoken about it a lot in the past. And the reason we decided to do it is because that is de facto what most of the nation of Israel who is interested in this stuff does. So to stay in sync with them, for good or for bad, the rabbis are the de facto power brokers at this point in time. We hope that it will not always stay that way, but to stay in sync and to stay relevant on a week-to-week basis to what other people in the nation of Israel, both in the land of Israel and outside, are thinking, reading, discussing, we decided to bow our heads and kneel before the rabbis in this case, and kowtow to them, and take our foreheads and put it to their feet, and do the weekly. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but to make a long story short, we are consciously following the rabbinical schedule because it just happens to be de facto what is relevant on a week-to-week basis in the nation of Israel at that time. So just a little bit of explanation is warranted there. Go ahead, Yaakov.
Yeah, and so the way we're going to do this was, of course, we'll read the Hebrew, and then we'll be translating probably. I'm not sure.
I think so. I think for the public study, assuming that we're going to assume that some people here are not yet fluent and I say yet because the hope is that they will be eventually, are not yet fluent in biblical Hebrew, I think it would be worthwhile to render translation. I also think we can invite people out there if they want to read. This is something when I used to do my own Torah studies a while ago. You know, if someone wants to read a standardized translation, that's fine too. And you can pick your favorite translation. And if we have a disagreement with that translation, that's actually a good thing because we can, you know, it's a point for discussion on why that word was translated incorrectly by the King James Version or the New International Version or whatever the case may be. So if someone would like to volunteer to read the English, that's fine too.
Yep. And you know, learning biblical Hebrew, it'll help you understand why a lot of translations are translated the way they are. And sometimes you don't have really a false translation, but you're able to identify the biases of those translations on which particular word they choose based upon certain beliefs that whatever group translated the text may have. And so while you can't say, oh, that's a false translation, specifically, you do see those biases, and that's really good.
Yep, definitely. And you can also see sometimes not only the biases, but the techniques that various translators use to render the you know, the Hebrew into English. Like for instance, when a word is in doubt, some translators will refer to the Septuagint, or they'll refer to the Aramaic translation, the Targum, to try to get clarification. So they're actually relying on ancient interpretations, which may or may not be correct, to come up with their modern English interpretation. It's very interesting, the whole idea of, you know, the whole source of the translations and the whole variety in which the translations are arrived at. But I must say, for the most part, if you take any English translation or any translation for that matter, most of the time you're gonna end up with more or less the same translation, but the differences will be significant in some cases, and those are actually very important talking points where the differences do show up.
Yeah, and I've told many people, the best translation is the one that you're going to read.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care really what translation it is. My personal preference is that everyone learn Hebrew. I know that's a very difficult thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
I began learning Hebrew when I was in my teens, and I still don't know everything.
It's impossible to know everything.
Yeah, it's just like English. Like I was born in an English-speaking country. I speak English as a native. Went to school for 12 years using English in school, and I didn't realize I didn't know English until I started college and had to take college English. I was like, my God, there's more English. And it's the same. It's the same way. I like to explain that to people. You know, just because you're a native speaker of a language doesn't necessarily mean you're an expert of the language itself.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's true.
And that's true for Hebrew. One advantage that a non-native Hebrew speaker has over some native Hebrew speakers is that we actually have to learn the grammar. Where people just learn how to speak and converse based on what they hear on the street and the slangs and everything else. We actually have to learn all the whys and rules and everything about it so that we can understand it and wrap our head around it.
Yeah, that's right.
So that actually, in a way, is a good thing. But anyway, so we'll go through and we'll read. We probably won't get through the entire parasha, any parasha, unless it's a really short one. Just because of the scope. We're going to read, we have to go through translations, and then we'll discuss anything that's interesting. Now, as we're reading, Melech and I, we'll see different things than anyone else is going to see. And you guys are going to see things that we won't see. So anytime we're reading and you have a point to make or a question, just, feel free to say, hey, I got a question or whatever, and let us know what the question is, or even an opinion, because you don't know everything either. So we learn just as much from each other or from everyone else as we do in imparting knowledge to other people. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, feel free. In other words, feel free to put, to join in, to chime in whenever you want. If you have a question, no question is too small, no question is too stupid. If we find that we feel it's going off topic a bit, or if it's not relevant, then we may put it aside and talk about it maybe privately or something like that. But please, chime in, render your opinion, ask your questions, and let's make this a two-way street, not just a lecture. I think is the best way to look at it.
Okay. So
with that being said, Yaakov, if you excuse me 1 second, I'm just going to go grab my computer, and you're welcome to start them off, and I'll be back in just a second. Okay.
All right. So we are in the book of Deuteronomy. This will be chapter 11, and we're going to begin in verse 26, which will be the beginning of the Parashath. ראה, אנוכי נותן לפניכם היום, ברכה וקללה. Look, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. את הברכה אשר תשמעו אל מצוות אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר אנוכי מצווה אתכם היום. The blessing is that you will listen and obey. Tishma'u means you will listen and also you will obey the commandments of Adonai your God, which this is being spoken from Moses, so the I here is Moses, which I am commanding you today.
So if I could just,
Yaakov,
if I could just say one or two things. So the context here is the book of Deuteronomy is basically, for the most part, it's a giant speech by Moshe, kind of the graduation speech before he goes up to Mount Nebo and dies. So this is a continuation of that speech, and that's the context. That's the context here. And as Yaakov and I spoke about when we did our private study the other day, a lot of the speech is organized into this idea of blessing and curse. You'll see that a lot throughout the speech. This is what happens if you listen to me, you'll be blessed. If you don't listen to me, you'll be cursed. And just to point out the mercy of God, again, we discussed this also in our private study the other day. The blessing is always much greater, both in length and in content, than is the curse. So this the blessings tend to be very long, very beautiful, very extensive, and then the curses come along and they're kind of short and harsh, and necessary. But you could see that that's not the main emphasis. Yehovah is not a God who wants to curse and punish and hate and all of this kind of stuff. He's a God who wants to be kind to his people, the people he loves, the people of Israel, and to all the good people in the world for that matter. And he created all of us. We're all his children. And he's a merciful God. He's a God who loves doing good for people and bestowing blessings upon people. And punishment is necessary. Any father who doesn't set limits for his children, and the only way to ultimately set limits is to punish at some point, right? I mean, you can threaten for a while, but if the child doesn't behave, at a certain point you have no choice but to render that punishment. So that's a sign again of a good father, not a bad father. But God is merciful. We see throughout the Torah how many times he was held back from anger. There were 2 times where he thought to destroy the people of Israel and was held back. Later on throughout the Tanakh, we see how long-suffering he was. It took him hundreds and hundreds of years and warning and sending prophet after prophet and relenting again and again before he ended up destroying first the northern kingdom and then the southern kingdom. So any of this idea that God, that Yahweh is somehow a mean, cruel, jealous, Old Testament God, as we hear about so much, it's just ridiculous. It doesn't bear itself out in the text. It doesn't bear itself out in history. It doesn't bear itself out in any way. And so when we're reading through, pay attention to how long and extensive and beautiful the blessings are, and how short and necessary, but how short and harsh the curses are. Okay, that's my 2 cents.
That's right. So just to re-emphasize the context, we see the context begins in the first chapter of Deuteronomy, and that'll be in verse 5, and it says, "Ba'ir hayarden be'eretz Moab, chohil Moshe be'er et haTorah hazot lemor." And so it says, on the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moshe began to explain to Be'er, or to explain, to clarify this Torah saying. And so this is where the context begins, where he first goes through the backdrop of how they got to where they're at now, and then he briefly covers the mitzvot. And so
And if
that's
I can point out, that's exactly the same word that's used by Ezra the scribe in the book of Ezra, if anybody wants to bring it up, when he is explaining the Torah on Yom Teruah to the people. And let's see if I can find it very briefly. I don't remember the exact chapter and verse, but it might be worth looking at for a second. 1 second here. Can't find it within a second or two. We'll just go on to the next verse.
Might be Nehemiah 8 and 8.
Maybe, yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. Actually, it is right, because that's when he explains the Sukkot. I think you're right. So let's bring that up. Yeah, Ezra reads the law. So this is Nehemiah chapter 8, and I'll just read very briefly. So all of the nation gathered together as one person in the plaza before the Water's Gate, which was one of the gates in the ancient city of Jerusalem, which is mentioned a number of times. And I'm going to skip ahead because we don't want to go off track too much here, but let me just find the V'ikra bo lifnei harachov asher lifnei she'ar hamayim min ha'or ad mahatzit hayom neged ha'anashim v'anashim ha'mevinim oznei kol ha'am et sefer ha'torah. 1 second. Okay, I can't find it right now. Maybe it does not use that phrase, but it's what it does say is V'ikra. So this is Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 3. V'ikra bo lifnei harachov. So he read in front or before that plaza, asher lifnei she'ar hamayim, which was in front of the Water's Gate. Mina or, from daybreak, ad mahatzit hayom, until noon, basically. Neged anashim, v'anashim, in front of the men and the women, v'hamivinim oznei kol ha'am el sefer Torah, and those who are explaining into the ears of all of the people the book of the Torah. And I could have sworn it uses be'er hetev, but I can't find it right now. Okay, I'm not going to look for it now. Anyway, similar idea. So we have this replay later on of Ezra, who was renewing the covenant basically with the people of Israel, and explaining to them the Torah in a similar sense to what Moshe is doing here in Deuteronomy. He's kind of expounding upon and clarifying certain things within the Torah. So an obvious question arises here. Why is this not considered adding to the Torah? In fact, many secular biblical scholars will say that the book of Deuteronomy is actually written by a completely different author. That's the documentary hypothesis. It's written by the D author, the Deuteronomical author, and that it's a completely different book written by a completely different author. And this explains why seemingly things are stated a little bit differently, and why some mitzvot that are not found elsewhere in the Torah are mentioned here. But any answers? Anybody want to render a thought on that? What's really going on here? Okay, I guess Yaakov, you want to say something about it?
No, but I would like to point out something.
Sure.
I was reading through this part of Nehemiah.
Yeah.
And it explains how they set up the Torah reading. And when you actually go to a synagogue, we still use the same basic form even today. The person who's going to be reading from it, Ezra was also a Cohen, and the Levites were with him, because it's the job of the Levites and the Kohanim in general to explain the Torah to the people. That's what it says in the Torah, that their job is to teach the Torah to the people. And it says that Ezra was standing on a raised platform before the people. He opened it up, blessed God, and the people said, Amen, Amen. And then he began to read and also to explain the reading itself. And so that basic form is still followed by both Rabbinites and Karaites alike when they do Torah reading.
So I think maybe we should address the question, because it's so central to Karaism, as to why some of the mitzvot we see here, when Moshe is basically giving his speech, we don't see anywhere else. And it could be construed as adding to the Torah, that Moshe is now adding to the Torah. So,
well, what we have to understand is we have the Torah itself, which the first mention of the Torah is talking about the tablets of stone. When God tells Moses, come up to the mountain, I will give you the Torah, which are the tablets of the stone. But we see that when Moses went up to speak to God, and actually this is something a lot of people miss, is Aaron was actually with him, because it says so. Aaron and Moses both went up, they heard the voice of God, and when Moses came back down, it says he wrote what's called the Sefer HaBrith, which is the scroll of the covenant. And then it says that God says, come back up, you and Joshua, and the elders of Israel with Aaron and his sons, and I'll give you the Torah, which are the tablets of stone. Now, whatever was on that, we know that not everything that would have been adjudicated in the 40 years that they wandered in the wilderness would have been written on those tablets. Now, it's controversial what was actually written on there. Doesn't matter. We know that not everything was actually written on those stone tablets. How do we know? We have verses in the Torah where it explains that the people came to Moses with concerns and questions. And it says he went to speak to God, and God told him, and he explained it to the people. And so when at the end of his life, he was told to write it all together. Okay, so all this jurisprudence in those 40 years is bound together in what's called the Torah of Moshe, which is the Torah of Moses, which was in a scroll that he gave a copy to the Levites to sit on the side of the Ark of the Covenant. And my personal opinion is that he gave not only a copy to the Levites, but to all the elders of the different tribes, so that they can all actually have within their tribal inheritance at least a copy of the Torah. So when you read the explanation that we're reading now in Deuteronomy, this is him just basically explaining. It's not necessarily that he's rereading the entire scroll of the covenant and everything that God spoke to him about, but he's covering all the events from the time that they left Sinai, which is where you begin in Devarim, to the point where he's standing on the mountain of Moab and is explaining the Torah. So that's why it seems sometimes we have explanation of certain commandments in this book that might be either a little bit different or explained even better than what they would have been in other parts of the Torah.
Mm-hmm. And if I could point a few things out, there are a couple of differences here between Moshe, so-called adding to the Torah, and let's say the rabbis adding to the Torah 2,000 years later, 1,200 years later. For one, Moshe is a prophet, okay? And that actually is all the difference in the world. So when Moshe speaks, he's not speaking out of his, I won't say the usual phrase because it would be disrespectful to Moshe, but he's not speaking out of his pinky. He's speaking with authority because he is in contact with Yehovah on a day-to-day basis. As it says in the end of Deuteronomy, there was no greater prophet than him who spoke face-to-face with God as a friend, as a person speaks to his own friend. So when Moshe speaks, he is speaking with authority, and he is speaking with the approval of God, of Yehovah. That's a very important point because all of the early leaders of Israel, up until basically the time of the kings, when prophecy and kingship were separated out, were prophets. There may be one or two exceptions where it doesn't explicitly mention that they were prophets, but if you look at all of the, pretty much all of the judges over Israel, they themselves were prophets. They spoke directly to God. Okay, so for instance, who comes to mind? Shmuel, Samuel, in the book of Samuel, obviously, was a prophet. He was spoken to as a child for the first time as he was sleeping in the temple after his mother Hannah had given him over to Eli the priest in the temple. So these are all prophets, and when they speak, they are speaking with authority. There is someone above them who they're in contact with, and that someone above them is Yehovah. So they're channeling Yehovah's will, and I think that's a very important point. So their so-called additions, which we can't even really call them additions, their clarifications are valid. They're not just thought up and dreamed up, the dreams of human beings who claim to be wise men, or who claim to be prophet-like, or who claim to be the official authority over the nation. These people can link themselves directly up to Yehovah, with whom they were in contact on a regular basis. And I think that's the main point I wanted to make. There was one other point, but I can't remember it right now. So if I can, I'll mention it afterwards. Anyway, so yeah, all right. Should we go on?
Yeah.
Does anybody out there have anything else they want to add or say? I did want to say very briefly that this idea of prophecy, of the head of Israel being a prophet, lasted until the time of the king. So we have the situation in the second book of Samuel, where Israel is defeated by I believe it was the Philistines. It may have been the Assyrians. At any rate, they call out for a king. They want someone to lead them in and out to war. And when finally Yehovah concedes and sends them a king, King Saul, at that point you see that the kings are not prophets. Now Saul did prophesy. It says so in in the second book of Samuel, that Saul was among the prophets. He went and prophesied among the prophets, but that was a very brief period of time. He was not a prophet. David was not a prophet. He never directly spoke to Yehovah. Solomon was never a prophet. He spoke or received messages only in dreams from Yehovah. So once Israel requested a king, so now you have a separation of, you could say, godly power and worldly power. The king, make sure my hand gets in this. The king represents the worldly power as kings in other nations, and the prophet represents godly power. And now it's the prophet speaking to the king, advising the king, or chastising the king, etc. But the original, and the king serve as a judge, as the head judge, but they're not prophets, and so they don't really at that point have the ability to clarify in the same way that Moshe would, who is actually a prophet. And one more point I want to make. Now I remember the other point I wanted to make. We see throughout the Torah that the Torah is not a static document. Okay, and we will discuss in this parsha that it speaks many times about the place which I will show you, or the place which I will choose to have my name. And this place is never mentioned anywhere in the Torah. In fact, it's not mentioned as the place up until the time of David, and that place is revealed eventually to be Jerusalem. So how do we explain this? We explain this as the Torah being a development over time. That prophecy is, God's will is revealed over time. It's not revealed all at once. Even in the Torah we see that, right? That over time different laws were revealed, and there's no reason to think that stops at the end of the 5 books of Moses. There's other information that's revealed. For instance, the covenant that Yehovah makes with the house of David for eternity, that's revealed only later on in the Tanakh. The choice of Jerusalem as the place which Yehovah will place his name, that's revealed later on in the Tanakh. Yehovah is constantly progressing, and the world is constantly evolving, and the Tanakh is a reflection of that. So so my point was, I guess my point is that as long as it's a faithful clarification or quote unquote addition to the Torah made by people who are prophets or ordained by prophets, such as King David was, such as King Saul was, even such as Solomon was. These were all explicitly chosen. They were all explicitly chosen by Yehovah through prophets. Then it's all part of the system that Yehovah laid out to expand upon the Torah. Now, I don't want to turn, I'm sure Yaakov agrees with me, we never want to turn these studies into rabbi bashing, because we could sit and bash the rabbis from here till eternity. There's a lot to bash. But the problem with the rabbis' addition, no, really, but the problem with the rabbis' addition to the Torah is that they don't have the authority to do so. They are not prophets. They're not in contact with prophets. The only thing they have is this claim of a chain of tradition that leads back to the prophets, and this is why they're so. This is why they are so insistent on the idea that their chain of tradition leads back to the kings and to the prophets. Because without that, they have nothing. Without that, they're a bunch of shmegegis sitting around the yeshiva somewhere in Babylon, coming up with their own ideas. You know, in the milieu, it's a nice fancy word. You know, in the atmosphere of of Zoroastrianism and other forms of paganism, or in the milieu of Greek Hellenism in the land of Israel. And so this is why they try to go to such an extent to prove that they are linked back. They are linked back through a chain of tradition to the prophets, and hence they come up with this completely false idea of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, this idea of the Great Assembly, where the last prophets, such as Malachi, sat together with the earliest rabbis and passed, and that's how the chain of tradition was passed down. Of course, there was no Great Assembly. It has no historical basis whatsoever. It is a historical lie. It is a fabrication by the rabbis to do exactly what they want to do, which is to assert their authority by trying to trace their chain of tradition back to those who actually do have authority, who were the prophets and the kings. Okay, done with soliloquy. Yaakov, anything you would like to add?
Just a couple points, and then I'll begin to read again. The place that we're going to be reading about, that you read about throughout the Torah, it was specifically said that God wasn't going to remove the nations from the land all at once. We read that in Hanan, which was 2 parishes ago, and it explained, why. Because the land would become desolate and you'd have all sorts of problems if you do it. So he said he would do it slowly and slowly. Then we read in the Torah that it says, once you get your rest from your enemies, then there will be a place chosen amongst your tribes that will be the central, basically the central court for all of Israel. And that didn't happen until the time of King David. Under the kingdoms of David and Solomon, that's when Israel, in fact, that was the whole story of David. David went out and he basically ended the Canaanites and the different nations that were supposed to have been driven out of the land. That's what he was doing before he ended up becoming king later. And so it was under the kingdom of David and Solomon that Israel actually had rest from their enemies.
That's right.
That's when that was chosen. And what I would like to point out to the Samaritans, it's even in the Samaritan Torah where it explains it will be once you have rest from your enemies that the place will be chosen.
That's a good point.
Okay, and so that's the only thing I would say. Hey, it might have been in Mount Gerizim. It might have been, but we know that when Mount Gerizim could have been the place, just like Shiloh was a place, Shechem was, which is where Mount Gerizim is, was also a place. Where was the other one? Mitzvah. Mitzvah was also a place where the Mishkan stood. And so you had different places. And that shows you that it hadn't been chosen yet. And so the Torah is very clear when it says there's going to come a time when you have your rest from all of your enemies, and then the place would be chosen to put the Mishkan and set the name of God. And so that didn't happen until the time of David and Solomon. There was no time before that, or even after that, because it was after the kingdom of Solomon dissolved that the kingdom split, and they just had problems ever since.
That's actually a very good point. I think we should ask some of our Samaritan friends how they respond to that. I guess they'll say that it was chosen later or something like that. Who knows?
Yeah. And the second thing is the idea of Sanhedrin. This Sanhedrin is actually a Greek name. The idea of the word Sanhedrin doesn't appear anywhere in the Tanakh.
That's right.
And nor does this idea of a great assembly. That doesn't appear anywhere in the Tanakh.
Sanhedrin actually means a sitting together. So
sitting together. That's right.
Yeah, sin means together.
Yep. And basically that's talking about conformity.
Yeah, or it's talking about an assembly, but the word is a Greek word. Sanhedrin is a Greek word, an explicitly Greek word, which means sitting together. The Sanhedrin was a body that was created by the Greeks to give the Jews within their territory some form of autonomy. So basically, they didn't have to deal with the Jews, as has been done for the Jews in many countries throughout history. Right, the ruling authority says, well, we really don't want to deal directly with the Jews. You set up your own ruling body that will answer to us, the ruling authorities, and as long as you don't, as long as you keep them, your Jews under control, then that's fine with us. We won't bother you. This happened throughout the Muslim world. It happens to a certain degree to this very day in certain countries. So that's what the Sanhedrin was, and eventually originally the Sanhedrin was contained Sadducees and Pharisees, but over time it basically was taken, as the nation was basically taken over by the Pharisees. So the Pharisees were able to gain power through the institution of the Sanhedrin. That's basically how they gained power over the nation of Israel until 67 BCE, where they wrote a letter to the Romans and basically said, could you guys come in and kind of help us out here? We're having a difficult time, establishing our authority. And the Romans came in, took over, and basically at that point appointed the rabbis as the official leaders of the Sanhedrin, until, of course, the Jews revolted about 130 years later. Anyway, so, yep, go ahead.
So let that just sink in. It
Mm-hmm.
was the Pharisees, okay, who actually invited the Romans
That's right.
in. And it was
That's
the Pharisees who ultimately caused the destruction of the temple and the dispersion of the people. And it was always the aim of the rabbis to destroy that temple. And I'll say why. Because the head of the Sanhedrin was always the Kohen Gadol. And once the temple was destroyed, the Sanhedrin, of course, went with it. Then the rabbis had full control over the people of Israel and could spoon feed them all this crap that they've been doing ever since. But the point is, the Sanhedrin was a Greek institution. Now, the Talmud and most of the traditions, like Melech says, is supposed to go back to Moses, but it only goes back to Rabbi Akiva. It doesn't go back any further than him. And also, they claim that the Sanhedrin was based upon the elders that Moses was told to get, the 70 elders. And the difference between what the Greeks did with the Sanhedrin and what Moses did with the elders of Israel is this: before Moses had these elders, he chose able Hakhams to be judges of the people. Anything that had to be adjudicated that was a really complicated matter, they had to bring it to Moses, and then Moses would explain it. Moses later said, look, these people are too big and they're griping and complaining too much for me to do this on my own. So God says, okay, you gather these men, and I'll take from you a portion of your spirit, which is talking about the spirit of prophecy, and I'll put it upon them that they may carry the people with you. These people were made prophets, and they were able to adjudicate even the matters that normally would have gone to Moses. It must be made clear that these people went with Moses throughout the wilderness, and it says they outlived those who had to die in the wilderness, because it says that at the death of Joshua, that the Israelites obeyed God and kept the Torah the entire time that Joshua lived, and throughout the days that those elders lived. Okay, and once that was over, that's when problems began to creep in. So there's no such thing as the Sanhedrin being based upon the authority of these elders, unless they're all prophets. Can't work. They all have to be prophets.
Right.
But anyway.
Absolutely. Anyway,
so,
all right. Back to Deuteronomy 11. Does anyone out there in TV land have any comments or questions?
I have a question.
Yep.
Yes.
When was the word Judaism started? Because apparently it
time
didn't
of the
happen
Greeks.
until the split of the kingdom, and it was made mostly of rabbi's interpretation in order for people not to forget what they learned because of the exile. So when exactly that happened, and whether or not this rabbinic Judaism that we experience today is not a true reflection of what Judaism was, or the Israelite religion was before the split of the kingdom. I'm trying to reconcile those terms in my mind.
Yeah, the word Judaism never appears anywhere in the Tanakh. In fact, the word Judaism is actually from the Greek, and it was invented by the Greek overlords who came in to try to destroy basically the Jewish people. And Judaismos in Greek actually means the Jewish people and their customs, and it's talking about the southern Judeans, and that's where that was coined. So that was coined by the Greeks.
Right. You do have.
So it's really not Judaism is really not meaning of a religion. It's mostly customs that Jewish people will practice up until today, not necessarily in a religious term.
And
is that a correct?
The first time in history that we ever see this word used is in the book of the Maccabees, which is a Greek document. It was written after the time of the Hasmoneans, but that's the first place we actually have the word Judaism recorded, and it was speaking about the customs of the southern Judeans. But when you actually read the book of the Maccabees, it explains to you what the customs were. It had to do with, the circumcision and the keeping of the Shabbat and stuff like that. So basically, the customs of the southern Judeans were the customs that were kept, talking about the keeping of the Torah. And it wasn't specifically talking about the customs of the rabbis and so forth later. That actually was an entirely different animal that actually the Pharisaic movement really began before the captivity of the Jews to Babylon. And that's what Isaiah talked about. He says, your fear of me is basically the commandments of men that was learned. And so we see it creeping in even before. And that's what the big accusation, the controversy that God had with the nation of Israel is the prophets became liars. They prophesied for money. The priests became corrupt. And the leaders were leading the Israelites, away from the Torah. And so they ended up going to exile. And it was in exile that the rabbinic movement started, because the word Arab is actually an Aramaic term. Whenever you have as a military leader or somebody who is a leader of whatever, that's when you first see the title Arab used in the Tanakh, is when the Arameans came and laid siege to Jerusalem. Who was it? Rabshakeh, who was the leader of this Aramean or Assyrian group. And so the rabbinic movement actually started to coalesce in Babylon. And that's why you have the Pharisees coming on the scene by the time of the Hasmoneans, because what the Pharisees did is they basically separated from what they called the corrupt priestly authority, because the priests had the authority at the time. And so that's where the controversy is. But that came about a little bit later at the time of the Romans, where you have the actual Pharisaic movement with their different customs and talking about washing of the hands and straining nets and all this other garbage that you read about even in the New Testament. And so that's where when the rabbis say Judaism, that's what they mean. But the actual beginning of the first time the word Judaism is used is by the Greeks, and that was specific to the Jewish people who had the Torah that they kept, because the Torah that we have is a little bit different than the Torah that the Samaritans have, just to make the comparison.
Yep.
Okay,
All right.
so
Should we go on?
Yeah, this is why it takes so long.
Yeah, it's no big deal. Hey, this is
Yeah.
I think it's better than just rushing right through, and
Yeah.
you know, it's good to to go off onto different subjects because there's a lot to say. every little verse really touches off an entire world of thought. So anyway, okay, yeah, go ahead, Yaakov.
وهكذا يملك تسمعوا إلى صوت أدوناي إلهيكم وصارتم من هدارة
Which verse are we in? Which verse are we in right now?
We're in 28.
So Deuteronomy 11:28 for everyone else.
Yep.
Yeah. 11:28. Okay. Re'eh Anochi. That's where you are. Oh, I'm sorry.
Re'eh Anochi is 26.
Okay, got it. Yep. Okay, so
وصارتم من هدارة أشر أنوخي مسوي أتشم اليوم لليخت أخري ألوخيم أخيرين أشر لو يدعتم. And the curse, if you will not listen and obey the commandments of Adonai your God, and you leave from the way which I am commanding you today, to go after other gods that you don't know.
And if I could just point out one of the things I love to do, and Yaakov is very into language as well, is whenever I see a word that can be traced to an English word, I always like to point it out. So if I may point out that the word derech is actually related to English words, and I think this is actually an admitted etymology. English words such as track, because derech, which means way or road, in Arabic would be tariq, and from tariq, it makes its way into the Romance languages. You have a lot of flow from Arabic into Spanish because of the conquering of the Iberian Peninsula by the Moors, and then eventually it makes its way into the Romance languages, which makes its way to English. I think that's one of the general flows. Another would be from Aramaic to Greek to Roman, and then down to the Romance languages, and then from French into English because of the Norman invasion of England in 1066, I believe it is. I have to ask my British friends, but I believe it's 1066. So at any rate, the word derech is related to words such as track in English, and I can't remember, there are a number of others as well that are similar. So anyway, I always love to point that out, because if you look at standard etymologies, you get this, and I know Yaakov hates this as well. You have this ridiculous idea of a Proto-Indo-European, where they'll trace words from English, usually back into Germanic languages, and then back into this language which is only in theory exists. It's never been actually found. But basically, what they do is they take the commonalities, like the least common denominator of various, usually Germanic languages, and sometimes Iranian, like Persian languages, Sanskrit, et cetera, and they'll say they'll reconstruct a root from this so-called Proto-Indo-European. This is I don't want to go into a whole long soliloquy right now, but this is, in my opinion, it's a bunch of baloney, and it's basically an anti-Torah, anti-religion view of linguistics, because many words can be traced back through the Romance languages to Latin, from Latin back into Greek, from Greek back into Aramaic, from Aramaic back into Hebrew and the surrounding Semitic languages, or alternatively, from Hebrew into Aramaic, into Arabic, and then crossing the Straits of Gibraltar into the Iberian Peninsula, into Spanish and Portuguese, from Spanish and Portuguese into English, and or into the Romance languages, into French, English, and then into our current English. So derech is one of those words that clearly has English cognates, one of them being track. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and one thing we have to really realize, and you find this in every field of modern science, linguistics is no exception. Genetics, man, they go crazy with genetics. They say they talk about how the Torah is all garbage. We all didn't descend from one man. Well, now we've actually found out, yeah, we did. We all descended from one man, and we all descended from one woman. Of course, they couldn't accept that, so they invented some kind of ungodly astronomical equation to make our mutation rate seem tens of millions of years old when that's not true. And the reason why is because they tried to come up with our mutation rates. They actually compare our genome with monkeys because it's their opinion that we descended from monkeys, and so that's what makes it so long. But getting back to the linguistics, like we all know that the different languages of humanity began at the Tower of Babel. And it says that God confused the languages. Now, this word confused or confounded, that's from the Hebrew balal, which means to mix. When it talks about making matzah, it says balula b'shemen, which means mixed with oil. So you need oil into the flour. And so what does it mean? Even the word confuse and confound are interesting. Confuse means to be joined together. Con and fuse means you join those together. Confound means you found it, which means you built the foundation of it together. So the languages were put in such a way that they are different, but they're still from the same source. And so when you look at the word earth, the English word earth comes from the Semitic or the Hebrew eretz. Eretz is ard in Arabic, is ara'ah, which is important. I'll come back to that in Aramaic. Now we have what's called metathesis in languages, where in different languages, the letters of certain words will be changed and rearranged. Okay.
Right.
So when we get to Latin, if we go back from Semitic to Latin, we have terra. Terra is just eretz written backwards. Okay.
Yep. That's exactly right. Yep.
Then we go back to Greek. Now we have the word Greek. What's earth in Greek is ge. Okay. Well, this letter gimel, ge, is actually from a part of the word or ayin. This ayin, which is how you say earth in Aramaic, also had a G component. So that's why in Arabic you have the ayin as well as the gayin. That's why you have in English Gamora when it's written Amora in Hebrew. And so that's also the word gay in Greek can be traced to the Aramaic, which goes back to the same area. And so to destroy our faith in the Torah, they invented what's called Proto-European or Proto-Indo-European or whatever. There's no such thing. It's all garbage. Anyway. So now we're on
so let's go on.
29.
29. So Deuteronomy chapter 11, 29. Yep, go ahead.
והיה כי יביאך אדוני אלוהיך אל הארץ אשר אתה בא שמה לרשתה ונתת את הברכה על הר גריזים ואת הקללה על הר עיבל.
And of course, if we could point out for, if I could just point out for one second. So here we have the blessing on Har Gerizim, and we have the curse on Har Eval. And we know, of course, that the Samaritans, as we mentioned earlier, they believe that Har Gerizim, that Mount Gerizim, is the place that God chose. In other words, the place where the Temple Mount, they believe that it's meant to be the Temple Mount and that all sacrifices are meant to be carried out on Har Gerizim. And of course, famously, they do the Passover sacrifice each spring on Har Gerizim. So I'm sure most of the people listening or who will be listening know that, but just wanted to point that out. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And it shall be when Adonai your God brings you to the land where you're going there where you are going to dispossess or to inherit. Then you shall give the blessing upon the mountain of Gerizim, and the curses upon the mountain of Eval. Halo himma בעבר הירדן אחרי דרך מבוא השמש בארץ הכנעני היושב בערבה מול הגלגל אצל אלוני מורה.
Okay, go ahead, Yaakov. Actually, let me just point out something very quickly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we have here Halo hema be'ever hayarden acharei derech mavo hashemesh. So and that's translated as are these places not across the Jordan? Meaning they're standing in the plains of Moab at this point. So we're talking about in the land of Israel, crossing the Jordan to the west, and after or beyond, and then it says derech mavo hashemesh. So on the derech or the way, and mavo hashemesh means the setting of the sun. So the way that you say in ancient Hebrew that the sun, there are a number of ways, but one of the most common ways is ba hashemesh or mivo hashemesh. The sun basically comes. It's like it comes home. So if you want to say sunrise, you say the hashemesh yotze or tzeit hashemesh. The sun goes out, and sunset is mavo hashemesh or ba hashemesh. The sun comes back home. So it's almost like this imagery of the sun going out, and then in the morning, and then coming home at night. In the Tanakh, it's actually compared sometimes to a chariot that's racing across the sky. So it's as if the chariot goes out in the morning and then comes back home at night. So I just thought it was interesting when it says Mavo Hashemesh, it's literally the road or the way of the setting or the coming of the sun, which means the way of the sunset, which means west, basically. Go ahead, Yaakov.
Yep. So the translation is, are they not on the other side of the Jordan? Now, when it says Ba'ivr Hayardain here, this is from the point of view of Moses. He's standing in Moab on the eastern bank of the Jordan River. So he says, aren't they on the other side of the Jordan, which would be in the land of Israel? On Acharei Derech Mavo Hashemesh, which means on the other side of the way of the setting sun.
The road of the way of the road of the setting sun, I guess you could say.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, the way of the setting sun, or the direction of the setting sun, in the land of the Canaanites, the ones dwelling in the Arava, which is before Gilgal, or at or next to the oaks of Moreh. And that's an interesting phrase because you have the Adonai Moreh. This was a person who actually lived in Hebron. And when we're seeing the in Bereshit, but whether that's the place or not, I'm not going to say. But that's just a basic description of where these two mountains are that are being spoken of. כי אתם עוברים את הירדן לבוא לרשת את הארץ אשר אדוני אלוהיכם נותן לכם וירשתם אותה ושבתם בה. For you are crossing over the Jordan to enter into and to possess or to inherit the land which Adonai your God is giving to you. And you shall possess it or inherit it, and you shall dwell in it.
And if I could just point out one thing, in verse 30, it mentions Gilgal. So Gilgal is the actual place where the Israelites crossed the Yarden. That was their first landing point in the land of Israel, was Gilgal. And I will try, as Yaakov continues to read, I visited with my good friend Bruce, who may join us, Gilgal last year, and I'll try to bring up a picture too. I don't know if I could put it on the screen, but I'll try if I can. So go ahead, Yaakov.
Yep. ושמרתם לעשות את כל החוקים ואת המשפטים אשר אנוכי נותן לפניכם היום. And you shall be careful to do all of the ordinances, the hukim, and the judgments, the mishpatim, which I am placing before you today. אלה החוקים והמשפטים אשר תשמרון לעשות בארץ אשר נתן אדוני אלוהי אבותיך לך לירשתה. כל הימים אשר אתם חיים על האדמה. These are the ordinances and the judgments which you shall be careful to do in the land which Adonai, the God of your fathers, is giving you to possess all the days that you are living upon the land. عبيد تعبدون את כל המקומות אשר עבדו שם הגויים אשר אתם יורשים אותם את אלוהיהם על ההרים הרמים ועל הגבעות ותחת כל עץ רענן. You shall certainly destroy. And this word, when you have, this is the infinitive, abayed, and then you have the imperfect, plural, ta'abdun. So anytime you see this form in Hebrew, that's an emphatic form. That means you shall, without a doubt, you shall definitely, without any question, absolutely destroy all the makomot, which is the places where the nations worship there. So this has to do with the places of worship of the nations of the Canaanites where they're going in.
Right, and if I could point out for those who are still learning biblical Hebrew, the main way that biblical Hebrew and actually modern Hebrew very often expresses emphasis is by repetition of the same noun. So here you have abed abdun, right? So maybe if you were to translate it literally, it would be usually translated as you will most certainly destroy. But literally it would be destroy all of these places, you know? I'm trying to think of in English some examples, something like, you know, this is used, it's not as frequent in English, but if you were to say something like, it's very, very hot outside, right? That's the doubling of the very is used for emphasis, okay? And I'm sure there's some other examples in English, but in Hebrew, the main way to express emphasis is repetition of the same word in slightly different form. The other thing I wanted to say here, if I could just find it, is so at the end of verse 2, it says, let me just find here, Yoshim otam et Elohehem al harim haramim, okay, ve'al hagivaot v'tachat kol et ra'anan. So you're going to destroy these foreign gods, okay, which are on the mountain, the high mountaintops, al harim haramim, ve'al hagivaot, and on the hilltops, v'tachat kol et ra'anan, and under every, it's usually translated as a leafy tree, or a refreshing tree or shady tree. So, so obviously we're talking about many gods, right? And you know, these were polytheists, and they had many gods. In the case of the Canaanites, the main god was the Baal, but different Baals depending on where. But you have many gods and many places of worship, right? As opposed to monotheism, as opposed to what the Torah lays down. Just earlier we spoke about it, which is you have one God, Yehovah, and you have one place of worship. That place which God is going to choose to have His name dwell. Okay, one God, one place of worship. Many gods, many places of worship. The other thing I wanted to point out is this very phrase, al harim haramim ve'al gvaot tachat kol et ra'anan, which is now applied to being applied to the Canaanites, who live in the land is later in the Tanakh used to describe Israel when they've turned to idol worship. And I don't have chapter and verse in front of me. I believe it's in the book of Isaiah and a number of other places where Yehovah complains about Israel worshiping their foreign gods on every hilltop and under every leafy tree. So this very same phrase is later on, ironically, applied to Israel when they've turned to idol worship.
Yep, and that's one of the reasons why the Canaanites were told to be, we were told to drive the Canaanites out of the land, is because they would be a mukesh, which is a trap, a snare. And in last week's parasha, it says, "Lo tenakesh behem." Don't be ensnared, or don't ensnare yourselves because of them by allowing them to remain in the land. And that's why we were told not to intermarry.
And to destroy them. It's considered cruel to wipe out an entire nation, including women, children, and even animals. But any trace of them left in the land would have been like a cancer that grew among Israel and eventually infected Israel with this horrible sin of idol worship. And that's exactly what happened. The land was not cleared out. Joshua, Yehovah complains to Joshua at the end of the book of Joshua that he did not conquer all the land as he was supposed to. And a lot of the Canaanites were left in the land, and eventually they did turn the Israelites to idol worship. This is precisely what happened. So let me just see here. If you want to look very briefly at Isaiah chapter 57 verse 5, we have that same phrase of Et Ra'anan being applied to Israel. Just bring it up here. Oops, there we go. One second. And let's go to Isaiah 57:5. So this is what Isaiah chapter 57 verse 5 says. Hanehamim ba'elim tachat kol et ra'anan shochtei yeladim benahalim tachat s'ifei hasalaim. So it's speaking about Israel that has now turned to idol worship under tachat kol et ra'anan, under every leafy tree, and that phrase appears many times throughout the prophets to describe Israel's turning away to idol worship. So it's irony that the same phrase is deliberately reused later on to refer to Israel. Okay, Yaakov, anything else you want to say about that or about this verse?
Not here.
Okay. All right.
So we have chapter 12, we're at verse 3 now.
Yep.
ونتستم את مذبحوתם وشبرتم את מצבותם وأشريهم تشرفون بأيش وفسلي إلهيهم تجدعون وإبادتم את شمام من حمقهم هو. And it says, and you shall tear down their altars, and you shall break apart their matzevot, which is a matzeva is a standing stone.
Yeah, and I think we should explain what that is. I think we should explain what that is, which is basically, it was very common in the ancient Near East to take a large stone or a heap of stones, sometimes called a gal of avanim, a heap of stones or a large stone, and either pour oil over it or sacrifice on it or near it. And this was called a standing stone. It was basically kind of like a little tiny portable altar where you worshipped your foreign god.
Yeah, and you see Joshua when he gets to Gerizim. It says, in fact, in Devarim, it tells you that whenever they went across the Jordan, they were to take 12 stones from the Jordan, erect it. They erected it, I think, in Gilgal, and they had to put plaster on it, and then they wrote the commandments, the Torah upon it, and that's called a matzeva. And so you see that throughout the Near East, where they had standing stones. Sometimes they had writings or pictographs on them, and that's just a place where they would do their communal worship. And so the altar, which could be of stone or whatever else, we were to tear them down, and it says we were to break apart the standing stones. So we're not only to, push them over, we're to actually break them, which is what the word shibar means.
To break them into pieces.
Right.
Break them into pieces. Shatter.
And the asher, that's the poles. You had basically wooden poles that they would use, or they could even be trees. We have instances in the Torah where it says you're not allowed to erect an altar under a tree. So this was to be burned in the fire.
Yeah, they were generally the Asherah was generally a female fertility symbol, and that's why it was often a tree or a pole which represented a tree, because trees bear fruit, and fruit represents fertility, right?
Yeah.
In fact, the word fertile very possibly comes from the Hebrew word pri. I'd have to check that out, but it's just something I thought of right now. At any rate, so these female goddess symbols of fertility, which are often made out of wood, were often in the ancient Near East, you often had the male symbol, or in the Canaanite regions, you had the male symbol, that was the Baal, who was often represented as a bull. And then he had a wife, and his wife was the Asherah. This was the female fertility symbol, which was often represented by a fruit-bearing tree. So that's what it's speaking about here.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And the pasil is in a sculpture.
Yeah.
In the sculptures of their gods, tegadderun, which means you shall pulverize them. Yeah. And you shall destroy their name.
As was done to the cow, to the
That's right.
whatchamacallit. How do you call it? How do they call it again in English?
Into powder.
Yeah.
And you shall destroy their name from that place.
Speaking about the gods.
Yeah, the names of these gods. Because we have another commandment where it says we shouldn't have the mention of these other gods in our mouth.
That's right. That's right. And of course, that refers to bowing down to them or worshiping them. We're allowed, of course, to talk about them on a historical basis, or just when we're referring to them, because the Torah does it many, many times. Mentions these foreign gods by name throughout the entire Tanakh. So the context there is that when it says do not allow the names of these gods to come out of your mouth or out of your lips, the context there is in the context of worshiping them. And many, but just to point out, and many Orthodox Jews believe that they're not even allowed to say the names of these foreign gods at all in any context whatsoever. And it's funny, but it's typical again of the way the rabbis will misinterpret the Torah, and they will take things out of context and turn them into these absolute commandments rather than understanding them in their context, which is don't worship them. It doesn't mean never say their names.
So Lo ta'asun kain Adonai Elohechem. You shall not do so for Adonai your God.
Right. So and let's just point out what is this referring to when it says Lo ta'asun ken Yehovah Elohechem. It's not referring to the destruction of all of these idols. It's referring back to verse 2, where it says Atem yorshim otam et Elohehem al harim haramim ve'al givaot ve'tachat kol etz re'anan. In other words, you're not going to be worshiping your God, Yehovah, your one and only God, on top of every mountaintop and under every leafy tree. Because verse 5.
Because or for
Yeah.
Im il hamakom asher yivhar Adonai Elohechem mikol shivtechem lasum et shimo sham lishichno tidrasu uvath sham.
And if I could point out a number of things here, unless you want to say something, Yaakov.
I just want to translate the verse first.
Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
For you shall go to the place which Adonai your God shall choose from all of your tribes to set his name there. To his dwelling you shall seek, and you shall go there.
Mm-hmm. And if I could point out, so again, we see this paradigm of monotheism, or that one God requires one single place of worship. And this is a central idea in the Torah that distinguishes the religion of the Torah, quote unquote, Judaism, from the pagan religions. One God, one place of worship. Okay, many gods, many places of worship, and this idea of a centralized location that Yehovah is going to have basically dwell is very important, because everyone has to come to this one place. You can't just go everywhere. So it kind of, in a sense, prevents idol worship or forces people to be centralized in their worship, and therefore hopefully worship the one God. Although, of course, as we learn later in the Tanakh, that place of worship in Jerusalem was turned over to the worship of foreign gods, for instance, in the time of Josiah, for instance. So, and another thing I wanted to point out here is it says here, Ki imet el hamakom asher yivhar Yehovah Elohechem. Okay, so it says will choose. The word yivhar is the third person singular future, the subject of the phrase being Yehovah. God will choose. Okay, it doesn't say God has chosen or God is chosen. It's saying will choose. And when the Torah uses the future, it really does mean the future, because the future can often be implied or expressed using the present tense. So when the future is used, it usually is trying to explicitly say something that will specifically occur in the future. And this goes back to what we spoke about before, that place has not yet been revealed, and it is not revealed until the time of King David himself. It's alleged, or it's kind of foreshadowed in a number of places, but it's not explicitly stated as the place that God's name shall dwell until David in the book of 2 Samuel explicitly requests from God that he would like to build a permanent home for him, for Yehovah.
Yep. So I need just a short break. If you want to take over, Melech, until I come back.
Sure.
And I'm gonna turn off my video in my microphone, but I'll still be able to hear.
Okay. I was thinking maybe what would be nice is, or maybe we'll say for next time, because I don't know how I would set it up, is when I used to do the Torah studies on my own, I would interject with some music. And that's always a nice break. Maybe it is time for a little bit of a break, but I have no idea. Oh, you know what? I could do it. I have an idea here. Let me try something here. And maybe I can get a little bit of music going, and we can take a little break. And in the meantime, does anybody want to say anything? Anyone have anything to add? First of all, can you guys all hear me? That's number one. Just
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
good. All right. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to say or add to what we've been talking about? No? Okay. So while Yaakov's taking a break, I'm going to put on a little bit of music, if you'll bear with me here for a second. And let's see if I can find it. This may or may not work. So I'm going to go here. I'm on my YouTube channel. And I've got to go to here, playlists. Yes, this could work. The channel has no playlists. I'm in the wrong account. 1 second. Account, no. Go here. Sign out. Okay. I can do it the simple way. Let's do it this way. All right. There we go. So I should disconnect the Bluetooth. Let's see if this works.
Yep.
It's one of my favorites. Can you guys hear it okay, by the way?
I hear it. Wonderful.
Psalm 121.
עושה שמיים וארץ, אל ייתן למות רגליך, אל ינום שומרך. הנה לא ינום ולא יישן שומר ישראל. השם שומרך, השם צילך, על יד ימינך. יומם השמש לא יככה וירח בלילה. השם ישמורך מכל רע, ישמור את נפשך. השם ישמור צאתך ובואך מעתה ועד עולם. שיר למעלות, שא עיניי להרים, מאין יבוא עזרי. עזרי מעם השם, עושה שמיים וארץ, אל ייתן למות רגליך, אל ינום שומרך. הנה לא ינום ולא יישן שומר ישראל. השם שומרך, השם צילך, על יד ימינך. יומם השמש לא יככה וירח בלילה. השם ישמורך מכל רע, ישמור את נפשך. השם ישמור צאתך ובואך מעתה
Okay. All right. All right. So back to Torah study.
Yep. We
All right.
are now
If I
in
can just
chapter
ask technical
12, verse
question.
6.
1 second here. Let's try to connect my Bluetooth for a second. Okay. Can you guys hear me? Can everyone hear me okay?
You good?
Okay.
Yeah.
And were you able to hear the music okay? Just for future
Yeah,
reference?
I heard it really great.
Perfect.
Okay, cool. I think it's always nice to break up the Torah study a little bit with, some music, some chat. Otherwise, it just becomes a little bit too dry. So, and before we go on, does anybody else have any comments or questions that they would like to add? Okay, we'll take that as a no. And let's get back to the Torah study. So, Yaakov, we were in verse 6. Where are we up to?
Mm-hmm.
So we're in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 6. Yehovah, or the Torah has just, or Moshe, I should say, has just made a distinction between the gods of the Canaanites. There are many gods. They're polytheism, right? They're Asherahs, which are the female gods. Doesn't mention here explicitly the Baal. Actually, the first mention ever in the Tanakh of the word Baal is in the instance of the Baal Peor, meaning the incident with Bilam and the Israelites and the Midianites. And but it doesn't mention it here. But it, of course, it implies that there are many gods and many places to worship those gods. And we as Israel are supposed to go in, wipe that entire system out, and establish one place, one God, and one place to worship that one God, which eventually is revealed as Jerusalem. Okay, verse 6. Go ahead, Yaakov.
وهذيثم شامة عولتيكم وزد حيكم وإت معصرتيكم وإت ترمت يدكم وندريكم وندرتيكم وبخروط بكركم وصنكم. And you shall bring there, your hold on, this is the ascent offering.
You should translate it as fire. Burnt offerings.
Yeah. And your sacrifices, and your tithes, and your the gifts of your hands, and your your oaths, and your free will offerings, as well as the first fruits of your flocks and herds, or herds and flocks.
Yep, and just to point out here that what verse 6 is speaking about are the many different types of sacrifices. So if you go into the details of a sacrificial system, all of these are mentioned and all of the details are given, and each one on a different occasion. So let's take, for instance, the olah is usually translated as a burnt offering. And what that means is the entire animal is burnt on the altar. Nothing is left over, and usually it's associated with the more serious types of offerings. Usually associated with sin, although sometimes associated with the yearly holidays. But that would be an olah, and that would be opposed to, let's say, nidrechem, a neder, as Yaakov pointed out, is a vow. So you make a vow. Okay, God, I'm in trouble here. I'm lost in the woods and I have nowhere where I am. If you get me out of this, I will sacrifice 3 sheep to you. Okay, so then you fulfill your vow. So God saves your butt, and you fulfill your vow, and by bringing 3 sheep to sacrifice. And usually, aside from the olah, which is the burnt offering, the entire animal was not burnt to a crisp on the altar. Usually, the forbidden fats were removed, burnt on the altar. And then the meat was cut up and cooked, and then given to the Kohanim to eat. So these are just the details of the different types of sacrifices you might bring to this one place. Okay, verse 7.
وأخلتم شم לפني أدوناي وهيكم وسمحتم بكل مشلح يدكم أتم وفتيكم أشر برخخ أدوناي إلهيك And you shall eat there in the presence of Adonai your God, and you shall make merry, or you shall
Rejoice.
rejoice, yeah.
Yeah.
In everything that your hand has sent, you as well as your house or your houses,
Right.
which Adonai your God, as Adonai your God has blessed you.
Right. And if I could just point out something there, we have an explicit holiday where we're told to rejoice at the temple, and that is Sukkot, and you can see that in, I believe it mentions it in Leviticus 23. Let's see here. Feast of Booths. So if we go to if we turn to Leviticus 23, second. It may not mention it here. Yeah. Maybe it doesn't mention here, but it does mention regarding Sukkot that here it is. So it's Leviticus 23 verse 40, and it says, so you shall take for you on the first day. Really, it means by the first day. And once again, this is Leviticus 23 verse 40. So shall take for yourselves by the first day, Pri Eitz Hadar. It's usually translated as the fruit of the goodly tree, although that translation is up to interpretation. Kapot Timarim, so that would be palm fronds, Palm fronds. Ve'anaf Eitz Avot, and a branch of a thick-leaved tree. Ve'arve Nachal, and willows of the brook willows. V'samachtam lifnei Yehovah Elohechem shivat yamim, and you shall rejoice before Yehovah your God for 7 days. So we see that explicitly, and we have here, this is Sukkot. This is the Chag Asif, the harvest festival of Sukkot, where you're supposed to dwell in booths around the Temple Mount for 7 days. And here it explicitly says that you will rejoice for those 7 days. So that, in a sense, is a specific instance or specific mitzvot that's related to this general idea of going to the temple area and rejoicing. So just to put that in some context. Okay. All right. Verse 13.
Verse 13. Yeah. Verse 13. No. We're on verse 8.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I skip?
Yeah.
Oh, my mistake.
12.
Yes. Verse Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 8.
لو تعصون ككل عشر نحن عاوزين بو حيوم إيش كل هيشار بعنا. And you shall not do according to the way that we are doing here today. Every person that which is right or good in his own eyes.
And if I could just point out a couple of things about this verse. So number one, so number one, the context here seems to be, so the translation, as Yaakov just said, is you should not do as we're doing today. Everyone does that which is good in their own eyes. Okay, so again, this is kind of the context here is referring or implying a lack of centralization of worship of Yehovah. That today we don't have this one place. This one place has not yet been revealed. So everybody does what is right in their own eyes. They worship wherever they want. They sacrifice wherever they want. Wherever the Mishkan, wherever the tabernacle happens to be, that's where they sacrifice. And of course, we know the Israelites, even in the desert, sinned. But the other thing I wanted to point out, and we discussed this yesterday when we were doing our private study, is that this phrase, that you should not do as we're doing here today, everyone does that which is right in their eyes, is used many times throughout the Tanakh to describe Israel when it had gone off track. And I'd like to bring one example. And again, I'll have to find it, but it's at the end of the book of Judges. I believe it's Judges chapter 21, right at the end. Let me just find it here. Okay. So if you turn to Judges, the book of Judges, chapter 21, verse 25, then it says there, so this is speaking about a horrible story in the end of the book of Judges, where a person from the tribe of Benjamin allowed a concubine from a Levite man to basically be raped all night long. And then when she was done being raped, her dead body was deposited on the doorstep of the place where the Levite man was staying for the night. Without getting to the whole story, there are clear references to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where the men of Sodom wished to abuse the angels that had come to visit, and were struck with blindness eventually. But here it says, so after this horrible incident, so what does the man do? The Levite man, if you don't know the story, he then takes this dead concubine, and after, it's a very strange verse, but it says, he opens the door in the morning and sees his concubine lying on the floor there, and says, come on, get up, let's go. I don't know, I've never been able to figure out that verse. But at any rate, she doesn't get up because she's dead as a doornail. And so he takes the body of the concubine, chops it up into 12 pieces, and sends it out, and sends one piece to each of the tribes in Israel to try to show them what a horrible thing has happened here. All the tribes come up and they basically go to war against Benjamin, and they wipe out the tribe except for 600 people. Okay, horrible story. We don't have to get into it right now, but this then says the last verse in the book of says, "En Melech El Enav Yaseh." Every person did which.
Melech, you broke up.
I'm sorry, which verse again? It's fine.
Yeah, let me just say you broke up. I didn't hear anything you said, so I don't know if it was recorded. So
can you hear me now?
The last thing, yeah, I hear you now. The last thing you said was "Ein Melech Yisrael, Ish HaYashar Be'anav Yaseh."
Right. So that's the same phrase we have here in the verse we just read. Which, what was the number of the verse again? Deuteronomy 12:8. Deuteronomy 12:8. Right. Okay. Lo ta'asun kechol asher anachnu osim po hayom ish kol hayashar be'enav. Right. It's exactly the same phrase, give or take one word. Okay. That this idea that when there's no centralization in the book of Judges, chapter 21, at the end of this horrible story about the concubine and the tribe of Benjamin, it's speaking about everyone did what was right in their eyes because there was no king, or it's implying that it was because there was no king. And later on, in the next book, that's when Israel goes ahead and asks for a king. That's in Samuel 1. And but here it's the same idea. If there's no centralized location for worship, then everyone will do what is right in their own eyes. So there's a definite push throughout the Torah and throughout the Tanakh for centralization, for unity, one place of worship, okay, one kingdom, a united kingdom between Israel and Judah, which of course is prophesied many times in the future that it will eventually come back together, right? Like in Ezekiel 37 with the dry bones, and one leadership, okay, whether it's a king or whether it's a judge over Israel, a prophet, a judge who is also a prophet. Okay, so you have this idea of centralization of leadership under the auspices of Yehovah. Okay, so that verse has a lot of importance. And so this phrase is used a number of times in the Tanakh when Israel has gone and everyone's, and has gone off track, off the derech, and everyone's doing what is good in their own eyes. Okay, Yaakov, anything you'd like to add?
No, that's pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're in verse 9. כי לא באתם עד עתה אל המנוחה ואל הנחלה אשר אדוני אלוהיך נותן לך. Because you have, at this moment, ata, which means now, right now, because until now you have not come to the rest, the menucha, into the inheritance which Adonai your God is giving you. Now, this is what I was talking about earlier. There's a place in the Torah where it explains that once you are granted rest from your enemies, then this place will be chosen. And so that didn't actually take place until the time of David and Solomon, which is really the only time in the history of Israel that they were actually at peace. Even all of the nations around them were subservient to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And also, it explains too, once this central place has been chosen, then you're not allowed to do however you want. You actually have to bring all of your things that you have to bring to that central place, which is why when you read in the Judges and Joshua and all these other places, it seems like people are making sacrifices wherever.
Right.
And that was because
That's
there
exactly
was
right.
no central. That's right.
Yeah. I want to point out that was something that it took me years to actually understand. I kept on seeing, for instance, is it Samuel, when he anoints Saul, Shaul, he does it. Yeah, he does it in, I can't remember the exact name of the place, but it's not in Shiloh, where the tabernacle was at the time, right? So you even have the prophets going around and the sacrificing in different places, and it's exactly the point. It took me years to realize that. Oh, it suddenly clicked. Yes, we're talking about this one place that God has not yet revealed. What?
You even see that in the time of David and Solomon. Before the temple and the central place was actually built, it even explains how David and Solomon worshipped on these bamoth, which means the high places.
That's right.
And then after the temple was built, which everything was collected in the time of David, put together and constructed under Solomon, and only then was the ark put in the Devir. And that's when it became chosen as the centralized place of worship. And all of this now is becoming effective. What we're reading now is at that point in time the law.
That's right. This law does not kick in until God reveals that place, which He promises here that He will at some point in the future. It's very interesting, that He's now saying basically that He's knows, He's going to reveal the place, but it's going to be later. He's not, either He hasn't figured it out yet, whatever that means, or He's not telling us quite yet. So
it wasn't time yet.
It wasn't time yet. That's a good way of putting it.
Just like it wasn't time for the Israelites to go in and just take the land of the Canaanites.
That's right. As it says in Genesis 15.
They had to go into
that for a second.
Egypt. Yeah. And that's interesting too. I don't want to get too sidetracked with that, but we'll read about it here in the next couple of Parashath, where at the end, when all this is said and done, and we bring our first fruits to the temple, we have to bring them in a basket. It says that you'll go before the Kohen Gadol, and you'll say, and you will answer All right, the answer, this is what we have to say when we got our first fruits,
Mhm.
is Arame Obed Avi. This is a famous verse. I think it's in chapter 26 where it says, a perishing Aramean was my father, and he went
Mhm.
down into Egypt and lived there, and there he became, or he went with a few people, and there he became a nation, numerous and powerful. And the story of the Pesach doesn't actually begin with Moses. It actually begins with Joseph, the dream of Joseph. Joseph had a dream about the tribes being subservient to him.
Mhm.
And of course, they were jealous and sold, basically tried to kill him. He ended up getting sold to the Egyptians.
Mhm.
And there he ended up becoming second only to Pharaoh. And when his brothers came, the first thing he did was test the brothers to make sure that they had actually changed and were sorry for what they'd done to him. And once that was established, he revealed himself. Hey, I'm your brother Joseph. Don't take it personally, for what you did to me, because it was God who sent me here
Mhm.
to save you, to help keep a remnant of you alive.
Yep.
Now, the story begins with Yaakov. There's a famine in the land of Canaan. And Yaakov looks at his sons who are there. He says, why are y'all sitting around looking at each other? I heard there was Shiva in
Right.
Egypt. He said,
Mhm.
go down to Egypt and buy
Mhm.
this grain so that we will live and not die. And that's what it's
Mhm.
talking about. My father was a perishing Aramean. Uh,
Mhm.
and because it was this famine. There's two things. It was the famine in Canaan, which prompted the Israelites to go to Egypt to begin with to be saved. And it was also this famine which was the reason that Joseph became second in command to Pharaoh. Because the dream of
Mhm.
Pharaoh was what? Of the famine.
Yep.
So it was understood. It was a famine in the time of my grandfather. It was a famine in the time of my father. So there must be another famine coming. So anyway,
Mhm.
so
If I, yep. If I could just point out for a second. Mhm. If I could just, yeah. Go ahead, Yaakov. Sorry.
no, I was just saying that was the culmination. Once that place was chosen, we had to go in and explain this is the culmination of everything from
Mhm.
Abraham, where it says, your children have to go to Egypt because the Avon of the Amori, uh, the the sin of the Amorites has not yet finished.
And that's the verse I was just about to read. So that's Genesis chapter 15, verse 16. This is in the what's called the Brit Ben Abitarim. This interesting or bizarre, I guess you could say, ritual of splitting the animals in two, and then you have this kind of furnace or torch that goes between the animals, and then Yehovah promises Abraham descendants and the land of Israel. And it says in Genesis chapter 15, verse 16, it says, "Udor revi'i yashuvu hena ki lo shalem avon ha'emori ad hena." So it's speaking about in the previous verses about how about how Abraham's descendants will have to go down to Egypt, and then it says verse 16, in the fourth generation they will return here, meaning the land of Israel, because this sacrifice took place in the land of Israel. Ki lo shalem avon ha'emori ad hena, because the sin of the Amorites is not complete yet or quite yet. Okay, the idea being that that the Amorites, the Canaanites, still have not done enough to warrant Yehovah's action to completely destroy them out of the land. That will take another 430 years, 4 generations of Israel suffering and growing Kura Bazel, in the crucible of the iron crucible known as Egypt.
Like that.
That's what it's called. And before the Israelites will go back up and dwell in the land and conquer the people. And of course, now what we're reading right now in Deuteronomy is now they're standing on the other side of the Jordan River, and they are about to go in and fulfill that prophecy that was originally given to Abraham in Genesis 15. So we see that Yehovah, I mean, if one theme I think that we've come back to again and again throughout the study is that Yehovah does not reveal everything right now. He reveals things over time, right? Why did he create time if it's not to take, to use it to reveal things over time, right? If everything were revealed at once, there would be no need for time at all, to get a little bit existential or philosophical. So we see that Yehovah, he will say things, and then over time he'll fulfill them. We're seeing that here in Deuteronomy 12 with the choosing of the place, which will be in the future, and then which is fulfilled when David asks Yehovah to build the temple. And here we see the same thing with the possession of the land, which is now being fulfilled, will be fulfilled in the beginning of Joshua, but they're now standing on the other side of the land, right across the Jordan River, right across in Gilgal, here in Deuteronomy, and they're about to fulfill that prophecy that was 430 years ago. No, I guess 470 years ago, because they have to add another 40 years for the wandering in the desert, was promised to their forefather Abraham. I'd like to point out one other thing, and this is the verse I mentioned to Yaakov, and a verse that I always love to point out, that this idea of time and this idea of things changing over time is not limited to the past. It's happening every single day, right? If we can use an example in modern times, the people of Israel have returned largely to the land of Israel. There are now, the majority of Jews in the world now live in Israel. If anybody had said 100 years ago that the majority of Jews in the world would live in the land of Israel, people would have thought that they were crazy. They would have thought they were just, some kind of crazy messianic fantasizing type. And a verse that I always like to point out is Jeremiah, chapter 16. Let me just turn to it here. I believe it's chapter 16, verse 14. And I was speaking with Yaakov about this the other day. Oops, Jeremiah 16. Just turning to it here. Verse 14. And this is speaking about the end of days.
I think we lost you again, Melech. Melech. Yeah. Unfortunately, that's the problem with modern technology. So I apologize. Melech will be back here shortly. Hopefully he'll come back. So if there's any questions in the meantime, feel free to ask the questions. If not, I'll just continue to read the parasha. We are only, in fact, this is the last verse of the first aliyah of the parasha. So we actually have 6 more aliyot to go, which we definitely won't get to today. It's already been almost 2 hours since we began. So verse 10, chapter 12, verse 10. وعبرتم את הירדן ושבתם בארץ אשר אדוני אלוהיכם מנחיל אתכם והניח לכם מכל אויביכם מסביב ושבתם בטח. And it says, and you shall cross over the Jordan, and you shall live in the land which Adonai your God is causing you to inherit. And he shall give to you rest from all of your enemies, which surround you, and you shall dwell securely, betach, which has to do with peace and security. And so that's the end of the first aliyah. And so if we have any questions on the aliyah, feel free to just interrupt me at any time. Is everyone still there?
I have a question on the when it says the on the 10 verse 10 it says go over the Jordan to dwell the land which Hashem your God constitutes to inherit, and He give us the rest of all your enemies. When they said the rest from all your enemies, I believe that's something very futuristic. If it's going to happen, and if it happens, where He choose to put His name on that place, which is Shiloh. Are we talking specifically Jerusalem?
Well, that's what we were saying, and this is the context too. The context begins. We're talking about when they're going to go into across the Jordan, go into Israel. They have to go through the land, destroy all these foreign places and centers of worship, get rid of all the idolatry. They were supposed to drive out because we read in the last 2 Parashath where it says you're to drive out these nations. You're not supposed to intermarry with them because they'll become a snare to you and cause your sons to enter into idolatry. And so this says you're not to do the same for Adonai your God, but it's to this place which will be chosen. And we read in one of those Parashath where it says that God won't drive out the people immediately, He'll do it slowly, and then after you've been given rest from fighting and taking over control of the land, it says then there will be a place that will be chosen where He'll set His name. And so He's basically explaining here that you haven't yet gone into your rest. They haven't even crossed over the Jordan yet. So how could they enter into the rest? The rest is, and the word rest is from nuh, which means to cease movement, to pause. When it talks about the ark of Noah, it came to rest. Okay, this doesn't mean that you're fatigued and you have to recharge. This is wayanach hateva, and so the boat or the box came to rest. So the manuha here is the ceasing, the resting from the wars of conquering the land, which didn't happen until the time of David and Solomon. So when we see this part, it's reinforcing what has already been said, that you're going to go to the land, you got to conquer these people, you got to drive them out, destroy the places of worship. And once all that's accomplished, you have rest from fighting the enemies which surround you in the land. This isn't talking about world peace in and of itself. It's talking about the completing of the conquering of the land of Canaan, which is what was given to Israel, and then the centralized place of worship, which is what we're about to read now at the beginning of the second Aliyah. Okay, Melech, take it away.
Yeah, my phone went dead. I got so carried away that I didn't know. I was getting warnings: 20% battery, 10% battery, and then goodbye. So, all right, I just wanted to finish making that one quick point, which I think is so central to the Torah, and people miss it. That, okay, people think that the Torah is some kind of static document, that God is some kind of static God. We've already seen a lot of evidence right here in the verses we've discussed that God is, I won't say changing, but he's revealing things over time. He's using time to reveal his will and to make his plans come true, okay? Otherwise, if everything happened at once, there would be absolutely no use for time. Time is a method by which we as human beings, I don't want to get too existential, but this is what I spend my free time thinking about usually. Time is a method that was given to us human beings to basically change for the better or for the worse, to grow and to change, right? It's the whole reason we have time in a certain sense, okay? Time, I would also say, is a projection of the consciousness. If you want to find out more about that, look into a book called Biocentrism by Dr. Robert Lanza. I highly recommend it. At any rate, I'm not going to go down the route of existential philosophy, but what I do want to say is we see in the Tanakh many instances of things being revealed and changing over time. It also goes back to the philosophical question that many people ask: how can God change his mind? Right? He said to Abraham that he would change his mind regarding Sodom if Abraham could find even 10 righteous people in the city. All right, so which he did not. God changed his mind twice regarding the destruction of the people of Israel and replacing them with Moses, with Moshe. Okay, so how could God change his mind? Well, the whole idea of time makes it possible for God to quote unquote change his mind, or things to happen over time, right? Things to modify themselves over time. Or else, if everything was completely static and there was no change and nothing was growing or changing or getting better or getting worse, there would be no need for us to have been given this gift of time, this projection of our consciousness known as time. So the point I wanted to make is in Jeremiah chapter 16, verse 14. And this speaks about something that's going to change in the end of days, okay? And I think this is very important. It's a verse that's often overlooked. I think it's a very important verse. It says, verse 14, L'chein, הנה ימים באים נאום יהוה ולא יאמר עוד היהוה אשר העלה את בני ישראל מארץ מצרים. Verse 15, כי אם היהוה אשר העלה את בני ישראל מארץ צפון מכל הארצות אשר הדיחם שמה והשיב אותם אל אדמתם אשר נתתי לאבותם. Okay? And I will translate the verse. It says, לכן הנה ימים באים, therefore days are coming, declares Yehovah, and it will no longer be said, it will no longer be said, as Yehovah lives. That's the way that Yehovah is invoked in a usually in an oath. As Yehovah lives, who raised the children of Israel up out of the land of Egypt. Ki im haYehovah, but what will be said instead, but what will be said is, as Yehovah lives, who raised the children of Israel up out of the lands of the north and out of all the lands to which he had banished them, and he will return them to their land, which he had given to their fathers. Okay, the implications here are immense when you think about it. Okay, because God's main. Okay, if you read throughout the Torah, the main miracle or the main action that Yehovah is remembered for, as proof of his power, as proof of his connection to Israel, his covenant with Israel, is the Exodus. Right, the whole Passover story. This is kind of the foundational holiday or the foundational event of our nation. Okay, Moses was wandering with his sheep in the desert and suddenly saw a burning bush. And the next thing you know, now he's back with Pharaoh and telling him to let the people go. And eventually this is done by force. They go out into the wilderness. And 2 months later, not on Shavuot, by the way, 2 months later, they are getting the Torah. Okay, so the main thing throughout the Tanakh that you can see again and again is that it said, God is remembered constantly. Yehovah is remembered constantly as being the God who brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. Okay, so much so that the entire holiday of Passover, which is arguably the most important holiday, it's the first holiday in the agricultural in the year, and it's also the holiday in which we have the Passover sacrifice, which is so nice. They did it twice. It's so important that you were allowed to do a second Pesach Sheni if you missed the first one. Okay, so oops, sorry, my mom was calling. I just had to turn down my mom's call. See how important this is? That's horrible. At any rate, so what I was going to say is that this foundational holiday will not even be remembered in the future. In other words, God, Yehovah, will not be remembered for Passover, will not be remembered for this foundational action of him taking the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but he will be remembered for what he's going to do in the future and what he's already begun to do, which is for bringing the children of Israel back from the lands to which they've been banished to the land of Israel. So much so that the Passover will actually be forgotten. He will no longer be remembered for that. And if that isn't proof that the Tanakh, I won't even say the Tanakh is changing. The Tanakh is not changing; it's a static document. But if it isn't proof that Yehovah is constantly changing and revealing new things as time goes along, that essentially the world is evolving, humanity is evolving, working from looking back towards the past, from the day of creation of Adam, right? That's when humanity started its journey on this earth, looking ahead to the future, to the end of days and the so-called Messianic age, okay? Or the return of Yehovah and the restoration of the line of David. We see that things are constantly changing, things are constantly evolving, and so this is a common theme and a very important theme, and a theme that's not understood, in my opinion, and constantly overlooked in the Tanakh. Okay, that's it. And it also relates to vegetarianism, which I believe vegetarianism will return in the end of days, but I won't even get into that right now. It's a whole other topic in and of itself. If you're curious, ask me on the side. All right, Yaakov.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna just mention it's been 2 hours now.
Right.
Where I'm at, it's already 5:30 in the evening. I would like to just finish out this section. We have the Satuma, which will be in 20.
Yep.
20 actually begins the next section, so I'll read to 19, and we can talk about that. And then after that, I will have to go. Even though I would love to stay with you all day.
Yep.
But the context we're getting in now is what we were talking about earlier, that the place hadn't been chosen yet, and once it does, then all these things will come in, which is what we're talking about now, because the last verse of the first Aliyah explained that they hadn't yet been given rest from their enemies, and they're not yet dwelling safely in the land. So verse 11, وَهَيَا حَمَقُمْ أَشَرْ يَفْحَ أَغْنَى وَحَيْخَمْ بو لشخن شمو شام شام ثبيئو أث كل أشر أنوخي مسوى أتخم أولثيخم وزفحيخم معصورثيخم وثرومة يدخم وكل مبحار نذريخم أشر تبدروا العلونان وحيا همكم, and the place shall be. This is in the future. وحيا, and the place shall be, which Adonai your God shall choose to cause his name to dwell there. You shall bring all of the things that I'm commanding you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, and the offerings of your hands, and all the choice, the mivchar and midrecha, all the choice things of your oath that you've sworn, which you have sworn to God. وسمحتم لفني أدونai Elohechem, أتم وبنيكم وبناتيكم وعبديكم وأمخوتيكم وهالليوي أشر بشعريكم كي أين له حيلك ونحل التكم. And you shall rejoice in the presence of Adonai your God, you and your sons, your daughters, your male and female slaves, and the Levite, which is in your gates, because he has no portion or inheritance with you.
If I may just point out in verse 12 there, okay, that again, the list of people that is mentioned here that you shall rejoice with, okay, your sons, your daughters, your male servants, your female servants, and the Levite is the common list that we see throughout the Torah of the underprivileged, shall we say, or those who could easily be, taken advantage of because they don't have the same position in society that others would, right? Sons and daughters, because they're young and they're not yet independent. Servants, manservants, and maidservants for obvious reasons. The Levite, the reason is listed here because they don't have a portion in the land. They don't have their own land. Okay. If we go very briefly to Exodus chapter 20, which is the 10 Commandments, we'll see that this list is very similar to the list that is mentioned explicitly as those who have to rest on the Shabbat. So if we go to Exodus 20, verse 8. Start there. I'll do it very briefly. Yom Shabbat lekadsho. Remember the Shabbat, the Sabbath day, and make it holy, or in order to make it holy, sheshet yamim ta'avod v'asita kol melachtecha. For 6 days you shall work and you shall do all that which you need to do. Yom Shvi Shabbat Yehovah Elohecha. And on the 7th day is the day of ceasing, the Shabbat, for your God Yehovah. Lo taseh kol melacha, you shall not do any work. Ata uvincha ubitcha, you and your son and your daughter, your sons and your daughters. Avdecha v'amatcha, your manservants and your maidservants. Ubehemdecha v'gercha asher b'sharecha, and your animals and the sojourner, how would you translate it? Convert.
Resident.
Probably a bad modern translation, but those the foreigner, not foreigner. We won't get into it now, but basically the foreign person who lives among you permanently, who is in your gates. Okay, so we have here a very similar list, and these are the people. So why does it mention with regard to Shabbat these people? Because again, these are the people who could easily be taken advantage of, and they could be forced to work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Your servant, your maidservant, the ger, your animals. Okay, they could be put to work without any rest whatsoever, but they are protected. They are a privileged, protected class because they're an underprivileged class, and therefore protected by Yehovah, so that even the animals have the right to rest on the Shabbat. Same here. Even the manservants and the maidservants and the Levite has the right to come and rejoice before Yehovah at the temple. There are a number of other classes which are mentioned throughout, which are also in this protected class. The most common one would be the yatom v'almana, the orphan and the widow. Those are mentioned often as also underprivileged classes that warrant special protection from Yehovah. Is there anything else I want to say about that? No, that's all I want to say about that. Okay, verse 13.
Yep, and so it says, Hishmelecha pin ta'ale olatecha b'kul makom asher tir'eh. So it's saying, you shall be very careful unless you shall offer your burnt offerings, your olah, in any place that you shall see. Now this is still in the future. This is still contingent on the fact that the places would be chosen. כי אם במקום אשר יבחר אדוני באחד שבטיך, שם תעלה עולותיך, ושם תעשה כל אשר אנוכי מסע לך. It says, but in the place which Adonai shall choose, still future, in one of your tribes, there you shall offer your olah, your burnt offering, still future, okay? And there you shall do all that I'm commanding you, which is what he's talking about right here with this place. So all these things are contingent upon the land being subdued from the enemies. They have the rest from their enemies, and the place is actually chosen, which didn't happen, couldn't have happened until the time of David and Solomon.
And if I may point out, this is now the third time, if I'm counting correctly, that we've been told, that you should only go to this one place which God will reveal. Okay, and one thing that can be stated about the Torah is that repetition implies importance. This is now the third time that Yoah is telling us, don't sacrifice on every hilltop and under every leafy tree, but you go to this one place which I shall reveal to you in the future. Okay, the importance of this idea of sacrificing, of worshiping Yehovah in one place is paramount in the Torah. Remember also that in ancient times the Torah was mainly transmitted orally, okay, except for the scribes in the temple, except for the king, except for perhaps maybe there were some copies among the Levites in the Levitical cities. There were not written copies of the Torah. You couldn't, go onto online and type in Deuteronomy online and get a copy of the Torah. You couldn't even get a book, because books were not even invented until I can't remember when books were invented. 6th century, 7th century, something like that, as opposed to scrolls. And you certainly couldn't get a scroll because scroll was very expensive to produce back then, as it is now, right? If you want to purchase your own Torah scroll today, you'll pay $50,000 to $100,000. Okay, so the main way that information, that Torah was transmitted in ancient times was orally. Okay, the Levite or the Kohen or the judge, usually the Levite and the Kohen, would do public readings of the Torah. And we have an example of where that must be done in the Shemitah year. Okay, every 7 years, the king has to come and read a portion of the Torah to the people. But in general, that's the way the Torah was transmitted. So repetition is important. Okay, if any of you have ever been teachers before class, as I have been in the past, you know that if you want to get an idea across to the class, you have to repeat it many, many times. And the more important the idea is, the more times you're going to repeat it. And so here we've seen this idea of come to this one place, which I shall choose, repeated 3 times, and we'll see more. I think it's something like 9 times total within this parsha, something like that.
أراك بكل عوات نفسك تذبح وأخلت بصر كبيرك أدوني رخيخ أشر نتان لك بكل شعريخ حتى ماي وحتى حور يوخلن كسبي وخآيل. Only according to the desire of your soul you shall sacrifice and you shall eat flesh, according to the blessing of Adonai your God, which he has given to you in all your gates. The unclean and the clean shall eat of it, as the deer, so the ram. And this isn't to say that you couldn't kill animals and have food in any of your gates, okay? So this is the permissibility to kill and eat food, and you don't actually have to be clean to eat it. You could be unclean to eat because this is a common food. This is not a sacred thing going to an altar. Okay.
Exactly. That's if I could just point out that's exactly the point here. That what the Torah is saying, it's saying yes, you have to come to this one place, and that's where you have to sacrifice. But that's only speaking about sacrifices. If you want to go hunt a deer and eat it for dinner, that's totally fine. You could do that. You don't have to bring it up to this one place. You don't have to be in a state of tahara. You don't have to be in a state of ritual purity in order to eat it, as you would have to eat the holy foods. So the Torah is clarifying. Don't make it think that just because I'm telling you you have to come to this one place, that means you can't eat any meat outside of this one place. No, you can, but it has to be basically chol. It has to be basically everyday meat, rather than the sanctified meat that is meant to be for sacrifice or is meant to be given to over to the temple.
That is correct.
As verse 16 will say, don't forget not to eat the blood.
Yeah. أراق الدم لو تخلوي على الحارج tish بخني كمان. Only the blood you shall not eat. Upon the earth you shall pour out like water.
Yep, and of course this goes back to Genesis chapter 8, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just find it here. Noah built an altar, chapter 9. Covenant of the rainbow, right? Okay, okay, so it's chapter 9.
Verse 8, I think.
Verse, here it is in verse 4. Ach basar benasho damo lo tachilu. Okay? אך את דמכם לנשותיכם אדרוש מיד כל החיה דרשנו מיד אדם. Okay, that's already something else. So verse 4, so we're in Genesis chapter 9, verse 4. This is when Noah gets out of the ark and he's given a number of different commandments. Okay, so let's go to verse 3. Anything you see crawling around the ground, walking around, wandering around, remes literally means to crawl. You may eat it. Just as previously I'd given you vegetables, that's now hearkening back to chapter 2, Genesis chapter 2, verse 29. So now, just as I previously allowed you to eat vegetables or allowed you to eat plant foods, now you can eat whatever you want. You want to have sit down and put a bib on and have a lobster, which is a giant sea cockroach, basically, go right ahead. You want to eat a disgusting fat pig wandering around, it's not very Hakhami of me, but oh well, tough luck. Go right ahead. You can eat whatever you want. But you should not basar benasho damo, but the meat together with its essence, with its life force, you could say, its blood, you shall not eat. Okay, so this is the first time we're given the commandment. Okay, humanity, it's new rules now. You've gotten out of the ark. I realize that I cannot hold you to the high standards I had originally intended. Another example of God modifying his will, or changing his mind, quote unquote. So you can eat whatever the heck you want, but just don't eat the blood. Okay, and this is what this is referring to now in Deuteronomy chapter 12. Whatever verse we're in.
That was 16. Now we're in 17. لو تخال لأخل بشعريخ معصر دغنيخ وثروشخ ويسحرخ وبخروت بقرخ وصونخ وكل نذريخ أشر تدور ونذبطيخ وترومات يدخ. You are not able to eat in your gates the tithes of your dagan, which is your grain, your tirosh. This is the first wines, or the new wines, how do you say it? The first crop of your wines.
Young wine, I think they usually translate it young wine.
And your oils is haracha. This is has to do with the fresh, or this is your virgin olive oil, and the first fruits of your flocks and of your herds and your flocks, or any of your votive, or your vows, your promised or oaths which you have made, or your free will offerings, or the gifts of your hands. So this is just basically explaining that anything that will be considered sacred, okay, all these things are sacred things. They have to go to the altar and to the Kohanim, because a lot of this is basically payment for the Levites. This is going to be used for repair and construction of the Mishkan itself, because those are made from material that's not going to be everlasting. And so this is how they repair and do those things. כי אם לפני אדוני אלוהיך תאכלני במקום אשר יבחר אדוני אלוהיך בו, אתה ובנך וביתך ועבדך ואמתך והלוי אשר בשעריך, ושמחת לפני אדוני אלוהיך בכל משלח ידך. But it is before Adonai your God that you shall eat it, in the place that Adonai your God shall choose, you, your son, your daughter, your male and female servants, and the Levite, which is in your gates, and you shall celebrate before Adonai your God with everything that your hand has sent, because we're to eat our votive gifts and our free will offering when we get to that. That's what we eat. No, because we have to eat it 3 times a year. Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Pesach and Sukkot is a 7-day feast, and so that's what we'll eat when we get there.
So, and just to point out, so this is again a reiteration of the idea of, so right before this we said if you want to go kill a deer, or if you want to kill a ram, go right ahead. You can eat it in your gates. Yeah. That's just regular food. But now we're talking again about the maaser, the tithe, and if it's a tithe, now those you can no longer eat in your gates. Those have to now be brought to that one place and be eaten there on those three pilgrimage festivals, which, as Yaakov mentioned, are Hagamatzot, Shavuot, and Hagasif and Sukkot, and that's where you're supposed to eat them. And don't forget the Levite while you're at it. Make sure you give him his portion as well. Okay, so again, this distinction between average everyday food, which you can eat anywhere you want. The Torah is clarifying that in verse 15, and food which is holy or consecrated, one could say, or which has consecrated, we'll call it. Then those consecrated foods, special foods, whether the sacrifices or tithes, cannot be eaten anywhere. They must be brought up to the temple, or what will reveal to be the temple in Jerusalem, and it can only be eaten there. So that's the distinction. And that's it, I guess. Hello?
Yeah, I was reading ahead.
All right. So is that it? You need to end here, Yaakov?
No, I've got one more verse, and that'll be the end of the Satuma.
Okay.
And then it continues on. So it says, Hishamer lecha pin ta'azov et halewi kul yamecha al admatecha. And be careful that you do not forsake the Levite all of your days upon your land.
Mm-hmm. And if we can end again with another anti-rabbinical polemic, which is my favorite pastime. if the rabbis did anything, it's forsake the Levite, because they usurped power from the Kohanim and the Levites and took it for themselves. They took it for themselves. People who are not Kohanim or Levites or of the line of David took power for themselves. They took Gerim, who are a protected class, but who are not meant to be among the leadership of the nation. Caleb ben Yefune, who was not a ger. Yaakov and I have spoken about that many times. He was the brother of Othniel, and the son of Caleb, who was an Israelite from apparently the tribe of Yehuda, what was I going to say? So the Levites and the Kohanim are meant to be in the leadership of the nation and the line of David and the judges and prophets chosen by Yehovah, and not anyone else. So we'll leave it at that. Yaakov, anything you want to say about that, or any other topic?
No. It's interesting that when we look at the time of King David and how he set up, because you have to remember, it was David who set up the order, the Machdalot, I think is what they call it, the orders of the Kohanim and the Levites.
Right.
Now, interesting, he assigned, for each group, each section, each portion of the Levites, a certain function, as singers, as porters, gatekeepers, or whatever. But for the tribe of Kehath, which was the tribe of Moses and Aaron, these were the judges. It says he took them. It even gives you the number. I forgot how many it was. It was like 30-something thousand of the tribe of Kehath. He set as judges throughout the land of Israel. And how was that done? It was done because, according to the Torah, there were to be, I think it was 40 cities all total. I might be wrong with it, but I'm thinking it was 40 different cities throughout the land of Israel. 48. For the what's called the cities of refuge. It's actually a city to flee to for people who commit crimes, and they're going there for judgment. And that's where those judges were put in place. But this is exactly what the rabbis have usurped. They basically brushed aside the Levites and took over their job and their duties, and which I must remind
they are
everyone,
usurpers. They are usurpers from Babylon, and who imported Gerim, who are certainly welcome in the nation, but not as top leadership, and certainly not above the Kohanim and Levites, who are clearly okay. You may argue that Israelites are not meant to be in power based on dynasty, but clearly the Kohanim and the Levites are meant to be in power based on dynasty. That's explicit in the Torah.
That was their job. And also, if anyone wants to look at Israel today and wonder why, after so many thousands of years, 3 times every day, the rabbinical Jews would pray, "Oh God, let it be rebuilt in our day. Let it happen in our day." Okay? After all these thousands of years of praying for the return of the Temple Mount so that they can rebuild it, what happens? They give it back to the enemies of Israel, who bows down towards another city to the south and points their asses at our sacred place 5 times every day. And as long as the rabbinical power is in power and everybody plays by the rules, you will never have a temple rebuilt. Won't happen, because that means they'll have to give up their power.
That's right. And if I could point something else out, a good Karaite friend of mine always used to say, if you look at the main rabbinical prayer, which is the Shemona Esrei, the 18 prayers, it's actually 19 because they added another one. There's one very what's the word I'm looking for? One very I can't think of the word, but prominent omission, and that's there is no prayer in there for the return of prophecy. There's a prayer for many different things, but not for there's a prayer even against the Karaites or against the Sadducees, which is that Malshinim, and that all those who are heretics basically shall be destroyed. But there's no prayer anywhere in the Shemona Esrei for the return of prophecy, because if the prophets return, the rabbis at best are out of business, and at worst will find themselves hanging on crosses, which would be appropriate for them, around the walls of Jerusalem, or hanging maybe from the walls of Jerusalem would be more appropriate. At any rate, so with that happy note,
if you think about this, the prophets were. It said that the prophets did violence to the Torah. It says they did Hamas to the Torah. And that was before the exile of the northern kingdom. That was the northern kingdom had yet to go into exile, and both the north and the south were accused of doing the same thing. They were both became power hungry, money hungry, materialistic, and they worshipped all this foreign influence around them. And it says they did violence to the Torah. What if that's what it says to these people? Then what could be said of? And that's when they had a temple. What could be said of the rabbis now who actually prevent the Israelites from doing the Torah and having this central place of worship, which is we're required to do?
Yep. At any rate, all right. I guess we'll end it there. Last call if anybody would like to ask a question or make a comment. Anybody out there in the vast listening audience?
I just want to say thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
I enjoyed very, very much the Shabbat. Thank you.
Well, hopefully this will be a recurring event.
That's the idea.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
That's the idea. We're gonna take it seriously. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Minerva.
No, I was gonna say this is very this is what I was looking for exactly, to really get deep into the Torah and all different verses and discuss each one of their topics. This is what really I was looking for. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure.
You're welcome. Yeah, our pleasure for sure. So, okay, I guess we're going to end it there and say Shabbat Shalom. I'll put a little
Shabbat
music on in the
Shalom
background.
and Shavua Tov.
So, I'm up. Oops. First of all, put a little music on in the background. Hold on a second here. So the plan is, so first of all, thank you all for joining us. And the plan is to do this every Shabbat, hopefully at the same time, which is going to be 4 o'clock p.m. Jerusalem time, which works out to, hold on a second, 16 minus 7. I think that works out to 9 a.m. No. 9 a.m.
Yeah, about 9 a.m. Eastern
9
Standard
a.m.
Time.
New York time, and you figure out the rest from there on your own. And that's it. We really thank you for joining us, and wish you all Shabbat Shalom. And Yaakov, you're gonna put this up online somewhere?
Yep. As soon as it's finished processing, I'll publish a link to it.
All right. I'll put some music on, and Yaakov, whenever you want to end it, go right ahead.
All right.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.